Okay, it's my great privilege to introduce Mark Johnson, known to many of us, obviously very eminent businessman. He's had a distinguished long career in investment banking and directorships, etc. in business. He's also well known for his Johnson report. And the reason that this is important and we invited Mark is, again, as I mentioned earlier, Mark was very instrumental in getting a CIFR organisation established with government and government backing, of which we're very grateful. But he's also a leader and a thinker when it comes to public policy. And given the FSI and the importance of this inquiry after 17 years since Wallace, and certainly some earlier inquiries that have occurred, I think it's really important that implementation issues are considered, because when recommendations are handed down, certainly we want to see benefits in terms of how they actually affect citizens of Australia. So thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a great pleasure to be here and a privilege to be part of this, I think, very important gathering. Thank you for the nice introduction. Without false modesty, I am actually an entirely appropriate person to be here. And the reason for that is that first of all, I'm an old guy. So I've actually lived through Campbell and Martin and Wallace and so on. I was in fact round for Ray, which none of you actually remember, which led to ASIC. And so I'm an old guy. I've got some history with all of this stuff. The second reason why I'm an entirely appropriate person is that I bear certain scar tissue, which is otherwise called experience, in trying to get recommendations for policy changes in the financial services sector implemented. So I actually can speak directly to the topic. So for those reasons, I'm very pleased to be here. In 2009, the Australian Financial Centre Forum did a report for government on Australia as a financial centre, and Jeff Weir, who spoke earlier today, did most of the heavy lifting on that and ran the secretariat that put that report together. The forum mandate was to identify constraints and impediments to efficiency and competition in the financial system and to recommend measures to overcome them. Obviously, a much, much narrower mandate than the FSI. It didn't cover prudential and regulatory issues, for example, which are obviously a very big chunk of the FSI. The philosophy, if you like, the touchstone that we adopted of why you have a financial system and why it is highly desirable it be efficient is virtually, we adopted something that was virtually identical to that which the FSI has adopted, the systems for the well-being of all Australians. But I think perhaps in our report, the forum explicitly linked well-being to access to the best international practice. So the international context was quite clear. We said, Australians, the purpose of the system is for the benefit and well-being of all Australians, but Australians deserve world's best practice financial services, products and systems. So there was an explicit link to the international context. Also, easier for us, tax-related issues were not off limits for us. So I think those international linkages and the potential of those international linkages and the tax issues and their great importance to financial system efficiency, I'd certainly identify myself with Ross Buckley's views from before lunch, and as Jeff Weir also identified, tax uncertainty is one of the great inhibitors of financial system development in Australia up to international standards. The best way of summing up probably what we were asked to do in the forum was, somebody said, what you're really doing is scraping the barnacles off the boat. And I think that analogy still applies. The Australian financial services industry is in pretty good shape. You know, the boat is seaworthy. We've been talking about that, and the FSI confirms that. The boat is seaworthy, but like any boat, it picks up barnacles and growths over time, and it needs to be consistently streamlined. But our remit was only to look at existing impediments to make the system more efficient. It was not to modify the boat to make it more seaworthy. If I can stretch my metaphor, that is part of the remit of the FSI. We made 19 recommendations. 18 of them were accepted by the government. One of them was later de-accepted, and I'll tell you, I may or may not tell you how that came about. 5 years later, about half of those recommendations have been implemented. Very important recommendations, matters that we who put the report forward felt were important, but more important, matters which really represented a consensus across the industry as being important, have not been implemented. So what have we learnt out of this? And when I say we, I'm going to make Jeff my partner in crime. What have we learned about this, and what about implementation, and why is implementation a subject worthy of treatment by this FSI? Now, we got the official narrative, I guess, this morning from Prime Minister Howard, and I totally agree with his overall assessment. The fundamentals were laid down by Campbell and plus Wallace with a particular focus on regulation, and we've had a progression to a robust, efficient and well-regulated system. But that comes with a benefit of a perspective that you can only really have when you're the Prime Minister. You know, you've got the big telescope and you can sit on top of the mountain and you can see that wonderful policy progression. Can I give you some opinions from the other end of the telescope? When you're down there in the market and you're trying to do stuff and make a living and all of that kind of thing, what do you actually see when you look up the other end of the telescope? I'm such an old guy that one of my first jobs out of law school, I was still an articled clerk, was trying to redeem a debenture that had gone into default after Harold Holt's notorious credit squeeze of 1961. And you may say, what is the relevance of that? Those of you who have read John Edwards' biography of Paul Keating will know that the Holt credit squeeze of 1961 virtually broke Paul Keating's father's business. And it was broken because the banks withdrew their credit and the business had not been able to accumulate sufficient equity in those days because of what was called the undistributed profits tax. And John Edwards draws the conclusion, which I find entirely plausible, that Paul Keating acquired an antipathy to the banks out of this and saw the imposition of this undistributed profits tax as something that was inequitable. So, in 1984, Paul Keating authorised 16 foreign banks to come to Australia, when the conventional wisdom said there might be 2 or 3 or 4. Peter Mason will remember that. And dividend imputation, all of a sudden, came into being in 1987 when Treasurer Keating introduced this reform, which now many would see as one of the fundamental features in our whole financial system. The point that comes out of this, the generalisation that comes out of this, is that lots of these things have got a bit of a random element and they often take time to emerge. In 1977, when I was a little bit older, I wrote a letter to the Financial Review in company with several of my friends. I think we wrote it late on a Friday afternoon, and we sent it off to the Financial Review, and they actually published it, and the subject of the letter was to get Malcolm Fraser to redeem his broken promise to hold an inquiry into the financial system, which Mr. Fraser had promised before the 1974 election. But he had overlooked that, and we thought it would be a good thing if he was reminded of that promise. The significance of that is twofold. One, politicians have got selective memories, perhaps, but we all knew that. The second, to which I will return, is actually the media, and I will say specifically the Financial Review, in my opinion, has been very important in helping progress the implementation of financial system reform, and I'll come to that. A lot of what we've talked about today has to do with issues in superannuation and retirement income. And we're almost assuming that that's part of the financial system that has come out of the long lineage of Ray, Campbell, Martin, Wallace, and so on. It didn't. You know, we all know that it was a deal that was done by Bill Kelty and Keating and Hawke and so on with the unions in an attempt to slow down the inflationary spiral that existed in the early 80s. And so this great and very important part of our whole financial services industry came about from pressures and events that were not directly related to policy objectives for the industry. And as I think a number of speakers noted, you can see some of the consequences of that today. We've certainly got a superannuation system, and I think the gentleman from America, the professor who was interviewed by David, identified this. We've got a system for accumulation, but have we actually thought through the purposes and its ramifications for the rest of the system? And the answer to that is partly no, because it was a good idea, obviously, but it grew from reasons and pressures that were not as rationally put into an inquiry as a financial system inquiry can give you. So, you know, this is like what John Lennon said, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. And the world goes on, random events take place, but particularly time. Time moves on, requirements change, politicians change, political commitments change, and so on. And it's a long time between drinks and between inquiries. And we've seen totally new issues emerge since Wallace. We've got every reason to think that that will be the same here. And so the issues and recommendations that come out of this inquiry will not be the total menu that needs implementation over the next decade. New issues will emerge, and so implementation is going to have to be a dynamic process. There's going to be very major recommendations, aren't there? The too big to fail question has been asked, and so either it's got to be answered or parked somewhere. You know, that will take place, I assume, in some sort of bilateral negotiation between the policy authorities and the big banks. There'll be detailed recommendations. Some have criticised them perhaps as micro recommendations to achieve policy goals in superannuation and retirement income. When we think about the globalisation of the financial services industry, which a number of speakers have touched on here today, and when we think about the pace of technology and the potential emergence, for example, of alternative payment systems, it's quite clear that the agenda that comes at the end of this year with the concluded Murray report will only be part of the framework of issues that is going to arise. So, in my opinion, many of those issues will be resolved, in a sense, by bilateral negotiations. What do I mean by bilateral negotiations? The too big to fail issue is going to be settled between the big banks and the policy authorities, which are political policy authorities and the official family. And whether they'll actually get in a smoke-filled room and do it, or whether they'll fight it out over many years in newspapers, I don't know. But that will be resolved in that fashion. At the other end of the spectrum, there will be many micro issues. Take superannuation or whatever, and take the deficient disclosure regime. So those are the kinds of issues that are going to be worked out over a long period of time. So what follows to me out of that is that you have lobby groups and industry groups who will look after their own positions. But there will be issues which go right across the industry in which the lobby groups are inadequate to advance the policy recommendations, or where a synthesis of opinions is required from a number of participants in order to evolve policy recommendations. And that's what we ran across in the forum, and that's now getting to the sort of pointy end of how you actually achieve implementation. The policies we put forward were not lobby group policies, because that was not our remit. It didn't meet the standards of meeting the requirements of the Australian population generally, and that's the same issue for Murray. So, if I can make this work, who is involved in these things? Well, who's involved? In our universe, there's the officials, which I put up there, the Treasury, the regulators, the Reserve Bank and the ATO. There's the politicians, and importantly, the politicians can come in two shapes. They can come bipartisan, which they have throughout pretty much the whole period of financial market reform from Campbell, or they can come partisan or crazy. You've got industry, and there you've got very legitimate industry groups, lobby groups, I've labelled them there, but very legitimate industry groups. And then you get consensus recommendations, and that's what we were primarily dealing with in our forum report. You've got interest groups, consumer groups, very important, and increasingly making their influence felt. And from time to time, you've got particular unions organised with a particular point of view. And look at the structure of the superannuation industry, and you can see the importance of the unions as an interest group there. And then you've got the media, mainly print and mainly the Financial Review, and I'll come back to that, but I'm going to make the argument that pressure from the Financial Review has been just about as big a lever in actually getting our agenda forward as anything else. Every 6 months, when there's a dull news day and they've got nothing better to do, they say, what's happened to the implementation of the forum report? Or what's happened to, where is the recommendation about Islamic finance or whatever? And sometimes that strikes a nerve in a minister's office and things happen. It actually is quite potent. So you've got those interest groups, I think, and what else do you need to get specific recommendations implemented? Sorry, I've got to go backwards. It's bigger than this, but I think these are some of the key elements in what you need to get implementation of these matters. You've got to get a government that actually gets it. Malcolm Fraser didn't get it, actually. He didn't want a financial services inquiry Fortunately, John Howard was his treasurer, and we got it. But what we're all talking about, I think, in this room, is a government that actually sees a world standard financial system as important to Australia, for the reasons we've touched on in the philosophy, and desirable, a desirable feature of the Australian economy, and part of national positioning, that it is open, efficient and competitive, which they would like all sectors of the economy to be. I think it's also got to be consistent with an outward-looking country, so that it's alert to changes and opportunities, which have been mentioned by many of the speakers here earlier. So this is the aspiring to standards to give the greatest benefits to Australians, which, as I say, have generally had bipartisan support until, and we'll see what comes, but that's been one of the great features of financial system reform. You also need, then, a minister who gets it and a minister who's got cabinet clout. And we were very fortunate when we did the Forum report that we were reporting to Chris Bowen, who is a very intelligent, very hard-working guy. He was really interested in it, and he got it. And he did all his work, and so Jeff and I and the rest of our colleagues at that stage thought we were going to sail happily on with easy implementation. The facts are that the political environment has many competing claims, and look at today, and you really need a very strong political champion to get through and get these issues up amongst the 101 other priorities, the policy priorities that any government has. And the financial services industry is not necessarily the most lovable, warm constituent in which to expend your political goodwill. So you've got to have a minister who gets it and has cabinet clout. Then you've got to have a competent secretariat, in our opinion. Why do you need a secretariat? The secretariat has actually got to go across the industry, accumulate the relevant information, synthesize that information into policy recommendations that can be put forward as representative of an industry position, but one which also fits the criteria, that it is within the aims of the FSI or the terms of reference that we're trying to come up with. It is not a lobby group position, because the lobby groups can take care of themselves, but a position that represents an advance. The debt markets thing is actually quite a good example of that. There's 101 people out there who will tell you how to fix debt markets, but all from their perspective: dealer, underwriter, originator, lawyer, regulator, or whatever. And everybody says, yes, it would be a good thing if we got there. But to actually get there, you've got to talk across a whole range of skills and positions and synthesize out of that an appropriate policy recommendation. So you need that secretariat to function efficiently. The need for an implementation structure was actually recognised in Wallace, and Wallace recommended the formation of the Financial System Advisory Council, FSAC. Most of the people I know on FSAC and have talked to on FSAC say, oh, it's nice, but it doesn't work. And when you push them, the reason it doesn't work is that it doesn't have a secretariat. The members come along and deal with an agenda, but they do not have the ability to go out, do the legwork on a trusted basis and evolve appropriate policy-oriented recommendations. So the deficiency of FSAC, I think, lies there, and that is the sort of essential institutional ingredient that you need to put into a structure. As I've touched on the word, I think, trusted on a couple of occasions. Clearly, any implementation group like this has got to be trusted not just by the industry, but trusted by Treasury and the bureaucrats there, and trusted by the politicians. And this trust is, let me emphasize this trust can get quite sensitive, because many of the issues that we had to deal with had to do with tax matters, for example, and Treasury and the tax policy people very sensitive, quite rightly, about those issues. So we had a task force, and it only gets a gentleman's C, maybe, for what we did. It might even have failed, I don't know, but it certainly didn't get an A for implementation. Why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work partly because we didn't negotiate the whole structure fully with Minister Bowen when we first made the recommendation. If we'd thought it through, we would have got all the elements lined up and formally agreed, but he moved on and we got a new minister. Also, there was a very difficult structure in the government at that stage, because really there were three ministers responsible for various parts of our agenda: Treasurer, Assistant Treasurer, and Minister responsible for superannuation. So we had divided responsibilities. We hadn't negotiated a clear mandate. What did we do in these circumstances? We relied on we relied on a very few or small number of personal contacts, essentially Jim Murphy, who at that stage was the Deputy Secretary responsible for the Markets Division, and Chris Jordan, who's now moved on, of course, to be head of the Tax Department, because he at that stage was Deputy Chair of the Board of Taxation. So we were able to get access to key people for advice and decisions and for movement ahead, but it was done on an informal basis. We should have formalised that before we ever moved on. So we hadn't negotiated our lines of responsibility to the Treasury, to the ministers, and to other ministers responsible for tax and superannuation. We had suggested to Minister Bowen that we would give him a 6-monthly report, which he could in turn table in Parliament. And our thinking there was this will provide visibility, debate, and also the discipline that comes with transparency, because people will be able to say what happened, what's happened with this. We hadn't formally negotiated that, so that got lost. So eventually we almost came to be seen as an irritant by Treasury, who thought that they had total responsibility for our activities, and we didn't quite share that view. And we were certainly not necessarily supported by the Minister, because the Minister thought that we should be more supportive when the AFR said what's happened to the various recommendations, and we said. So we ended up getting beaten about the head from time to time. But when I analysed why we did, we'd actually made a litany of really very elementary errors, which we shouldn't have made, and I'm old enough not to have made those. We hadn't put the right structure in place. So what do you got to do? You've got to learn how to operate one of these things. You've got to try and put in place a structure that at least builds on those lessons. So Jeff and I put in a submission to the FSI along the following lines: that there should be a task force, that it should be composed of people from industry, not the CEOs, but many more people at the sort of worker level, and sometimes people who have left responsible positions but who can bring opinions and access to the industry. It ought to have a senior person from Treasury on it, and it ought to have a ministerial representative, because it's going to be the politicians who are ultimately going to determine the priorities for what reforms proceed. It should have a secretariat. It must have a secretariat. It doesn't need to be a big secretariat. 2 or 3 professionals we found was adequate to do the work that we did, and once you get people seconded from time to time, that's adequate. In our opinion, those people must come from the private sector. They should not be representatives of Treasury, and I'll come to that in a moment. How should this be funded? Well, I think it follows that user should pay, and so it should be funded from by the industry, some form of association or levy to put it together. Not going to be expensive in the scheme of things. And also for transparency and purposes of governance, we think there should be reporting, should be tabled in Parliament, whether it's 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is, should be the Treasurer or the Assistant Treasurer who ought to meet with the committee or the body whenever's appropriate. So it will occupy a little bit of the politicians' time and it will occupy a bit of the Treasury time, but the bulk of the work will be done by the Secretariat. Why not the Treasury? Treasury, I think, the guardians of high policy, that is their remit. The people are trained to deal with that. They are certainly not trained to go out and see commercial opportunities. And many of the reforms, particularly those that will arise down the track, are commercial opportunities for the industry, which are perfectly legitimate and in the interests of consumers. But being somebody in Treasury, you've got the wrong training, the wrong incentives, and the wrong background to seek out those kind of opportunities. So they lack, in my opinion, the Treasury people, not a criticism, it's just an observation, they lack the micro knowledge of emerging issues that you get from the market. Secretariat evolves those and Treasury can then tell you whether they're appropriate policy issues or not. And I guess the other point which became clear to us is the Treasury sometimes has issues when you run into conflicts of interest, essentially when you run into tax issues, and tax issues, as I think we've touched on, are very important in reform of the financial services industry. So the conclusion out of all of this is that despite the difficulties and problems that we had, I think we can agree that some form of implementation structure is highly desirable. We should get out of the FSI another great big stocktake of our financial services industry. And as General Eisenhower observed after he'd won the battles in Europe and after he'd been President of the United States, he said, plans are useless, but planning is everything. And the planning that goes into something like this, what that says to you is that it's got a dynamic base. So what is laid down here is useful, but you need implementation. So we put those recommendations forward, as I say, based on a pretty unhappy experience of, well, not an unhappy experience of our own, but an inadequate treatment of this. Our process was too informal and ad hoc, and for the volume of implementation issues that's going to arise over the next decade against the background of this financial services inquiry, we need a more formal implementation process. I think Jeff and I hope that what we've suggested will be a useful base for that debate. Thank you very much.
We have some time for a couple of questions of Mark. If you could raise your hand and we can get microphones to you.
Mark, I think you probably answered it implicitly in your last comment. When you said report every 6 to 12 months, I was going to ask how long, but then you said for the next decade. Is that, am I putting those two things together out of context? Or?
Well, I think the work that's here in this FSI report, or when it's finally produced, that will be, in a sense, the sort of first touchstone or benchmark that we go back to for the evolution of issues in the financial services industry over the next decade or so. That's certainly been the experience with Campbell and Wallace and so on. In terms of implementation, though, implementation is much more near-term, and if I'm correct, in 5 years' time, we'll be looking to implement the responses to issues which were never identified in the FSI. And that's why you need something that is much more timely. Whether it's 6 monthly or whether it's 12 monthly, I don't have a firm opinion.
Justin.
Yeah, Mark, I think that's a really great proposal. I suppose precisely because the FSI has a much broader mandate than simply, the development of innovation within financial services and involves a much greater range of actors, perhaps Secretariat, in actual fact, and the composition needs to be expanded. And there's a great example from this in the United States that dates back to 1964. This is the emergence of the Administrative Conference, which really looks at how the administrative process is operating across a whole range of administrative agencies, including the lawyers who interact with those agencies, the head of those agencies, industry. And in many ways, if the framework is set in place in relation to the FSI, the principles that we should be looking for our financial system, what a regulatory conference, if you will, a standing regulatory conference could do is evaluate to what extent that is actually happening in practice on an ongoing basis. But to be effective, I think it needs to be more expansive than the one that you've identified.
Yeah. Look, fair point. When we put this together, we took the view that you should have something fairly minimalist so it was well understood and people's eyes didn't glaze and say that's far too complicated. If this structure works, in a year or 2 or 3, this would be larger and probably separated because you would have streams that would be looking after capital markets, after banking, and after superannuation, probably. At the FSI conference in Cairns, Greg Cooper suggested that there should be a task force to work on internationalisation and international, or the whole international context we've been talking about, and he proposed that Treasury should be responsible for that. I think I would have a different conclusion. I think there's a need for that body, but I would have a different view on how it would be appropriately staffed. On the issue of dealing with regulators and that kind of issue and bringing their thoughts into all of this process, I think that's a role for people like CIFR to do that, in a sense, informally, ad hoc, seminars and so on, until the right structures, until the need for a structure is demonstrated and until you can identify the kind of structure you'd like to put in place.
Just one more question. Just over here.
John Morgan. Just picking up on what Pamela Hanrahan said, one of the things that I think a lawyer notices, which are the category I fit into, is that in this implementation phase, we've got to do much better in terms of that very difficult iterative process of formulating the legislative principles, the rules, the remedies, and the powers, etc., that the regulators must have. And there doesn't seem to be any sensible emphasis being given to the fact that you've got to do that very carefully. Because if you don't do that well and carefully, then you'll get the messes which we have now in our current regulatory systems. Because at the end of the day, once you get into a courtroom, it's what's in the legislation, it's what powers the regulator has, and what remedies are available, which really give this effectiveness.
Yeah. I take that point, and that's probably aimed right at the very small size of the Secretariat. What we found was that people right across the industry and associated with the industry would give a lot of time and expertise pro bono, the big accounting firms and the big law firms. So we got, for example, back in 2008, there was a big push for Islamic finance. It seems the political imperative for that has evaporated a little recently. But anyway, a task force went to work, an expert task force, and they came back with a whole cookbook of overlaying Islamic Sharia law over the Australian tax, accounting and legal requirements. So there's this cookbook there that says you can do that. Now, how important that is as a national objective, I don't know, but it's probably quite good to say we've got it. Anyway, that's sitting somewhere in a pigeonhole and hasn't been implemented. When you get on to particularly the tax laws, we spent a lot of time spinning wheels playing the ATO's game, which is, yes, here's this great thicket of law, and we'll modify this and we'll put in subsection that and that kind of thing, and that will accomplish the outcome. In our view, the problem with the tax laws is so material that you've got to get carve-outs in most cases to be sensible. And I think Minister Bowen, well, in his book that he wrote after he left office, he characterises the Australian tax system as the second worst in the world, and I wouldn't argue with that. So, you know, there are lots of people who gave us lots of very good advice and would design the stuff. But a lot of the stuff actually needs to be cut through before you can put new detailed laws in place. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Mark Johnson. Just a couple of follow-ups there. I found that incredibly valuable, very insightful. Sometimes we try to aim for best practice in terms of our technical know-how, but to hear the importance and the dimensions of how implementation needs to occur, and particularly from Mark, an eminent businessman, from his experience, I think is really important. And again, Mark, thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's my pleasure to hand over to Anthony.
Thanks, David. Now, this session won't take the time allotted in the program. You may be pleased to hear. Interesting that Mark quoted Eisenhower. I think it was John Brogden quoted Churchill, so we're certainly in some lofty territory here today. And to kick off this session, I'm going to ask for some additional feedback around the direction of the inquiry. You'll recall in the early session I talked a little bit about the judgments that have been made to this point in the inquiry, recognising it's got a way to run, but over not too long a period. Judgments around the challenges, you know, basically how is the Secretariat and how are the Secretariat and the panel getting a grip on such a vast range of material. It's understandable that they've attempted to do that by way of the diagram that's in your papers, the schematic that sets out the approach that's being followed. So there's going to be some questions around that, and a question to invite you to submit issues that you regard as priorities. Priorities have been identified. There's 9 of them. They're listed in the diagram. They're listed in your papers elsewhere. And it's a critical judgment as to what are the priorities at that level that warrant attention of the Secretariat and the panel. So in a few minutes I'll ask for some free-form responses to be submitted on that point. The second part of this session will be around some of the observations in the interim report, not all of the observations. Some of them are very straightforward. Some of them I think we've covered in sufficient detail today, so I won't ask the questions that are in the booklet. But nevertheless, we would like the additional feedback on those observations as well. All of the responses, including the free-form responses that will be submitted, not all of which we may be able to display on the screen today, but all of them will be packaged up and supplied to the Secretariat with all of the content from today by Tuesday. So back to the framing of the inquiry and a lot of the debate that we've had today. I thought it was a good question earlier, the question put to David Murray as to whether the interim report indicates that the totality of the work and the thinking of the Secretariat and the panel, or whether it extended beyond that. I think it's right that people be thinking about the framing of the inquiry. David Murray was asked a question last night at the consultation event, and he indicated that it by no means confines the thinking of the inquiry. So this second round opportunity is obviously critical, and I suspect the Secretariat may well be overwhelmed with content analysis, particularly on the quantitative front, by Tuesday, with not very long, as I said, to digest it all and to come up with an approach to articulate its recommendations. So the first question, if we can just kick off with a question around the challenges and opportunities that have been identified that are set out in that diagram. The inquiry's identified 5 at a very high level, and I'll read them out. They are in the booklet as well. Future financial crises, fiscal pressures, productivity growth, technology change and international integration. And the question is around whether these areas are a sound or a reasonable basis to use to inform identification of priority issues. Now, I admit this is a little bit simplistic in that it's totally understandable that there needed to be an attempt to conceptualise how the Secretariat and the panel go about their work, and these are judgments that in a sense, you know, who are we sitting outside the tent, so to speak, to critique the judgments. But I thought it's worth asking this group to express some views on that. And you can see the responses there. Not too many voting. I don't know if people are holding back, but there's a few more coming in now. And I'm unaware of whether the diagram was partly reverse engineered or whether it was worked from a top-down basis, probably a mix of the two. But it's just interesting to see the views of this audience on those challenges and opportunities. We might, because I want to move through these fairly quickly, we might go to the next question around the themes. And these are the themes into which the 9 issues that have been identified have been classified. Growth and consolidation, post-GFC regulatory response, and emerging trends. A similar question, do you think these are a sound and reasonable basis on which to classify priority issues? Now, in a sense, they may well just serve to help people sort of understand how the issues might be thought of, which certainly would assist the Secretariat in its work, but wanted to check the perceptions of this group. And this is not a scientific exercise. Obviously, the exercise is limited by the extent to which people are actually contributing to the polling. A clearer outcome at the moment in terms of the support. From there, you can see in the diagram the 9 issues that are identified. And I mean, this undoubtedly is a critical judgment. It determines where the effort is directed, points to areas where we might reasonably expect policy recommendations. And there are 9 that are listed in the materials and in the diagram. So the first question to ask, given what we've heard today, given your own views, the views of your organisation, is whether there are other issues outside those 9 that you can succinctly put forward for consideration. Now, all of the ideas that are submitted now will be pulled together, as I mentioned, and supplied to the Secretariat. We may be able to throw 1 or 2 of them up on the screen. We'll also ensure that you as attendees today receive the benefit of everything that's submitted. None as yet. Of course, by identifying priority issues, the 9, it doesn't mean that the Secretariat and panel won't be addressing other areas, but it's interesting that they've identified those 9 above all else. Data capture for availability of research. I was interested in Stephen Brown's comments about the quality of data here. Pleasing to hear that external perspective. I guess as a practitioner, a thought that popped into mind was, Lord help others in other countries working with their data. if we are regarded as being an exemplar in this area, because there are very significant data challenges in our industry, particularly in the superannuation sector. Taxation, which we've got a very clear signal, I think, in the interim report around the extent to which David Murray and the panel intend to address taxation matters, given the separate opportunity to do that. Trust. Trust as a concept, as a critical part of the landscape, not easily dealt with in terms of the work of the Secretariat, but undoubtedly a key concept. Educational and financial literacy. Tax again. We'll just see if there's one or two more to come through. Accountability. Accountability as an issue arises in a number of places. One topic we haven't spent time on today is the area of governance, in particular between parts of the financial services sector. There are some observations in that area. Regulators' accountability, integrity. I think concepts such as trust and integrity, whilst not addressed head-on in the interim report, undoubtedly are featuring in the thinking of the Secretariat and the panel as they think through issues and policy options. Culture is another. Okay, well, there's some good ideas coming through, and as I said, tax again, we'll pull those together for the benefit of the Secretariat. The next question we'll move on to, still thinking about the 9 issues that have been identified. Of the 9, if you had to nominate 3 above the others, what would they be? Well, they're moving around, but hopefully you can read the ones that are polling the strongest. Superannuation efficiency and policy settings, retirement incomes and ageing. We've heard a lot about those 2 topics today. International integration. And at the moment, no votes for stability in the prudential framework. Okay. Again, we acknowledge that this is a fairly simplistic approach, but I think it's still useful to see where people, what people's views are, perceptions are, having heard what we've heard today. The next question, again, on the 9 issues, the next question is around, again, prioritisation. If you had to nominate of the 9, 3 that you would deprioritise, perhaps to allow greater attention to the others, perhaps to allow greater attention to other issues to be elevated in terms of priority, what would the 3 be? So we've got stability in the prudential framework, funding Australia's economic activity and technology opportunities and risks. Okay, thanks for that. Still coming in. Next, a couple of questions. One is around technology, actually. If we just move to the next question, if we can. I believe this question was actually submitted by Fred Hilmer. Will technology lead to the entry of new firms that will make banking significantly more competitive within 5 years? Not overwhelming, but a pretty clear majority there. If we can move to the next question, this is around some of the balancing that the inquiry needs to do in terms of pursuit of policy objectives, and asks whether there are adequate processes to balance competition issues and prudential issues on an ongoing basis. Some participants just neutral or not sure, but a majority, significant majority of those who have a view say no. Now if we step now through to the second part of this session, which is around the observations. As I mentioned, we're not covering all the observations here. There's a good number that we're not covering, either because they're very straightforward, or not readily dealt with in this particular format. And basically, it's an extract or the full observation from the interim report. And if you agree with the meaning or the gist of what's laid out there, select yes. Otherwise, no or neutral. Okay, on to the next one. Again, in the superannuation sector, an observation regarding leverage. If you agree with the observation, yes. Otherwise, no or unsure. Okay. Next question is also in the superannuation space. Superannuation policy settings lack stability, which adds to costs and reduces long-term confidence and trust in the system. Next question relates to governance, which I mentioned we haven't had a presentation on this particular topic. It was touched on by some of Jeff Warren's comments and in one or two of the other presentations. And this relates to the activities of regulators, the regulator focus on the behaviour and responsibilities of board and management. If you agree, yes. Otherwise, no or neutral. Next topic on disclosure. The current disclosure regime produces complex and lengthy documents that often do not enhance consumer understanding and impose significant costs on industry participants. People are pretty quick on the draw with this one. The next observation is around advisors, financial advisors. Improving standards of advisor competence and removing the impact of conflicted remuneration can improve the quality of advice. There's not always one, David, there's two. Okay, pretty strong response there. And finally, comprehensive financial advice can be costly for consumers, and there is consumer demand for lower cost scaled advice, a very topical matter. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thanks for participating throughout the day, those who did, and for those, if you did or if you didn't, I'm glad that you were able to join us today, and pleased that many of you stayed for the entire day. I'd also like to thank the speakers for keeping to time. I think they all did a great job in that regard. So I'll pass on now to David to close the proceedings. Thank you.
Well, what a day. I really appreciate the input that everyone has provided today. I'd like to, I think that we've had some excellent presentations and contributions. The thing that was important about today was to provide constructive feedback on the interim report for the financial system inquiry, and also to balance that feedback with industry and academic responses, and I think we've achieved that. It's also been fantastic having a number of eminent speakers sharing their experiences over many decades, both in business and from a government regulatory perspective. I think that what we also need to recognise as well is that when it comes to providing, insights or recommendations in our responses to the Secretariat, that we balance all of the issues, and that I think it's also important that that we bring some scientific rigour to the recommendations or the insights that we offer, and that's certainly something that's unique in our domain as academics in terms of our public policy contributions and the opportunity that we have. Today, as at today, CIFR has funded or is currently funding 50 research projects. That is an investment of about $17 million. And just to let you know the importance of today, we're seeking to have our CIFR submission into the Financial System Inquiry Secretariat by next Tuesday. And the compilation of information and feedback today will be helpful for that process, but in particular, we're also going across all of these 50 projects that we've invested in and identifying areas where we can contribute based on work that's already been done. So thank you to all our researchers that have been working hard on their projects. I think it's also important to recognise the weight of expectation and the huge responsibility that the Financial System Inquiry Secretariat has got, not just by the sheer breadth of the terms of reference, but also the incredible timeframes that they're working to. And I certainly wish them the best in their next round of getting submissions and then achieving rigorous recommendations that government can consider in terms of their implementation. I'd just like to thank my team, in particular today Veronique, who's worked tirelessly up the back, hiding up the back there. I'd also like to thank Anthony Lane, who's done a fantastic job facilitating today, and again to my other team colleagues as well. The content from today will be made available in due course. The presentations have been videoed, and so once the submission goes in next week, I think from there on we'll be able to provide you with some of the content that you've seen today. Our next event, as Kingsley mentioned, is an important one. It's on the 1st of October. It is an important topic area. It's something that, even though Professor Stephen Brown mentioned about Australia having high quality data, which is correct, I still believe there's enough evidence to suggest that Australia has a lot of gaps in its data. And so one of the things that we think is important in a well-functioning financial system like we have is to take stock of what information we have, what data gaps we might have, but also to try to identify areas where we can encourage regulators to link data sets to enhance their understanding of things that are going on in the system, and having a truly collaborative, cooperative system where regulators can work together can only enhance and strengthen the system. So this event that will be on the 1st of October is a significant one for us, something that we think is innovative and somewhere that we feel we've got a comparative advantage over others in the sector. So just in closing, thank you again for your participation with us and your support. I'd like you to feel welcome to stay for some refreshments after that'll be served outside here. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.